I simply say economic growth is nonsense. No one knows what it means. Let's move to a new set of very simple measures.
So when I'm looking at the charts, everything is good, and that's usually when bad things happen. So if the S&P 500, for example, is going to reach an all-time high, the whole world is going to think everything's good, everything's growing, but that's when the collapses happen.
Investment produces business, it produces employment, takes people off the streets, raises incomes.
But I think as a kind of single dimensional focus, which often politics has on economic growth, it can leave other important factors behind.
I was blessed with a brain that was academic, and that wasn't enough, by the way, to get to where I wanted to get to, because we don't live in a meritocracy. It's actually, it's a false reality, I believe.
Meritocracy is actually dangerous.
With a global financial collapse on the horizon, even more detrimental than in 2008. What are the state politicians and privateers going to do as we face imminent failure? Well, there is hope in one man, ready to confront the challenge more than the rest, with a mission to change the world and to create a freer society. He might just be our only catalyst left and the source of truth that the next generation deserves. Phillip Ullmann, thought leader and social entrepreneur.
We'll move on to economic growth and future prosperity. Why are our economies failing to grow, Philip?
Yeah, the question's the wrong question. I hate to tell you, because what is economic growth? And what does the layman, what do your street homeless people think economic growth means? Well, they haven't got a clue. And I haven't got a clue. I'm educated. I haven't got a clue because it's meaningless. Because we come up with these measures which give power to the educated, allegedly, and to the politicians, because they can talk nonsense about measures that no one understands and they can manipulate, and it makes no difference to the real world. It's damaging. So fundamentally, economic growth is dangerous because, one, it can be manipulated, but more importantly, it encourages more and more consumption, and we're destroying the planet. Very simply put, so it's just a crude measure. So I would say we don't need economic growth, but we do need measures that actually enable us to ensure we're meeting people's needs. So I simply say economic growth is nonsense. No one knows what it means. Let's move to a new set of very simple measures: food, clothing, jobs, housing, security, safety, and get rid of all this nonsense.
Josh, rubbish. It's all rubbish.
I mean, I think it's an interesting perspective, and in many ways, I'm inclined not to continue to violently agree with Philip all morning. But I think sometimes we can have a misplaced focus on a metric like GDP growth, and it can hide all manner of sins in the sense of, quite often in the past, the UK and much of the developed countries have achieved phenomenal GDP growth, but it's come at a cost of leaving certain people behind, and it's come at a cost of impacting the planet, and it does require an ever-increasing growth and an ever-increasing consumption. So, I think whilst there's important elements to having a healthy economy and a healthy tax take, and that funds public services, and that's all important stuff. I think to get too fixated on GDP growth, which sometimes can come at the expense of other critical social and planetary factors, can be a misshaped focus.
Victor, it's interesting that you both talked about the GDP measurement, and I have to agree with this. It's kind of a bit of a smokescreen, isn't it, when we talk about wealthy economies and what's actually going on in the country?
Yeah, I think, the basic formula for GDP, if you define it, is consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus, the difference between exports and imports. And I think it's a good measure as a foundation to use because the reason why I say that, if we look at UK's growth, I think last year was at 4.1%. This year we're predicted to grow for around 0.5%. But if we look at countries around the world, emerging economies or countries like India, growth rate 7%, 6%. And I take that formula and I sit down in my bedroom and I look at, okay, what's the difference? And, I think Philip said we don't need more consumption. Okay, let's take consumption out the equation. What about investment? What's happening to investment in the UK? Or what's happening to foreign direct investment? Are people investing in the UK? Is it attractive anymore? Are there companies that people want to grow in the UK? And I use a recent example of Arm, which is one of the largest companies in the world. They produce chips that power 99% of all smartphones in the world. They're based in Cambridge, HQ headquarters in Cambridge, but they listed in US because essentially people don't want to invest, our tech infrastructure in the UK or investing in the UK is not seen as attractive compared to other states. But I think it's important because investment produces business, it produces employment, takes people off the streets, raises incomes. All these things actually help to get a happier society, I think. So economic growth, why is our economy failing to grow? I think there's a lag in one of these sort of factors, and I do definitely believe as well we need to also redefine what we're actually measuring as well in terms of happiness, which we'll get onto. But yeah, that's what I think so far.
You raised some good points, especially when it comes to giving people their desire to want to produce those businesses. So recently, it was Italy that started a new digital nomad tax. I think it's 10% for anyone that comes in as an incentive to go over there, because something to do with retirement age getting a little higher, etc. So that within itself is naturally going to pull people over there to think, well, I could set up my business over in Italy. I like the life, I like the food and the wine. I mean, who doesn't?
We do.
But to be able to, there's lots of reasons to the question about, why is the economy not growing? If we start to put measures in, like I said earlier, about taxing more of the rich and spreading that across, it will naturally, the large proportion are just going to be shifted somewhere else. I'm a big believer in what I can affect, and there's certain things in which I can't affect, and I just live in a reality of I know how most people are going to behave. You're always going to have a smaller portion that are going to think, right, we do need to take care of the planet, we do need to take care of the world. I think that's extremely important. But when you disincentivize, so I can only speak from the UK, and my judgment's a little bit skewed because you have to remember I come from a financial trading point of view, so everything's priced in a little bit different. So when I'm looking at the economy, as you were saying, why are we failing to grow, the stock market would tell you otherwise.
Well, this is what's interesting, isn't it, about this country?
Definitely. And you would think that the worst things come out in good news. It's a strange way to look at it. So when I'm looking at what's happening in the news and talking about GDP and all these things, I'm also looking at a completely different numbers and metric. I was like, right, so when I'm looking at the charts, everything is good. And that's usually when bad things happen. So if the S&P 500, for example, or the FTSE 100 is going to reach an all-time high, the whole world is going to think everything's good, everything's growing. But that's when the collapses happen. That's when the bigger players in the market, from what I've seen, will actually get out of the market. So it's a complex question, but I would say my mind is normally skewed because from what I see versus what I'm looking at in finance is always maybe 3 or 4 months in the future. So it tells a very different story.
Everything you don't like, Philip.
Absolutely, yeah. To me, democracy doesn't work because we have these measures that no one understands. So who are you voting
Mark
for?
understands.
No one understands, with respect.
Do you understand, Mark?
I understand charts, finance numbers, that's about it.
What is economic? It's such a complicated numbers no one can understand. There's millions of bits of information you can't understand. It's a collection of meaningless nonsense. So no, we need to make democracy work. We need to have measures that people understand. So when you're voting, you can vote for somebody who's actually going to look after people who are homeless. It's going to look after people who haven't got food on the table, who haven't got happy family lives, who haven't got meaningful jobs. And then we can start having debate about real issues rather than this very complicated notions that no one understands. It's not democracy.
Is it democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely take that point that you know, a metric like GDP growth, 95% of the population, they won't have a reference point for that, and it's not relevant, you know, to their day-to-day lives. I think, you know, I believe in the importance of business in the private sector and the jobs that creates and the tax revenue that creates. So I think it's important that that's supported in society. But I think as a kind of single dimensional focus, which often politics has on economic growth, it can leave other important factors behind, and I think perhaps it has a too strong a focus in our democracy. I believe.
You know, we mentioned twice now about the fact that these businesses are providing jobs and giving people a living. But one of the issues that we've got is it might be providing the jobs, but the wages that those people are getting are dreadfully low and do not meet with the cost of living. Never mind the £70,000 that people need to be a little bit happy. So we're looking at whether our children will be the first Western generation poorer than the one before. The answer's yes, isn't it, Victor?
I think then how do you define poor? I mean, if we're
£70,000.
You know, it's funny you should say that £70,000. I was with Andre Walker yesterday, who talks about the drivers of the underground trains, and they get £70,000, and they're saying, no, all it's done is it's kept them in line with the cost of living, which is what effectively Josh is saying. Yes, it's the same to that. They're not saying they're massively wealthy. They're just getting the same basic needs being met, and that's what they're saying. They're probably right.
Because 70,000, I mean, in the UK, if you are in the top 10% of earners, and this is for an adult with no kids, you have to earn approximately £2,600 a month. So that salary would be close to, if not below below £70,000.
Yeah.
And you know, in bottom 10%, we're looking at £700 a month. Now, to your question, would our next generation be poorer? I mean, the reason why I said define poor, if we're looking just in monetary terms, I think this is why, and going back to this, linking it with the last question, economic growth is important, income growth is important, is because if we don't focus on growing our incomes, what's going to happen is inflation would happen, things will get more expensive, our standard of living will sort of reduce in the UK.
Already is, I would argue.
Yes, no, it definitely is. It already is. It's forecasted to real incomes are reducing as it stands as inflation stays high. But I think, poor. I think we need to really focus on, you know, what is poor, because there's a saying, so I'm a Christian, and there's, you know, I would say that if I lose everything, or I have my peace and my faith, I'm rich. You know, Jesus, he tells his disciples parables about don't focus on your wealth on the earth, but store up your riches in heaven. So that's my perspective. You know, I came into the world with nothing, and I was telling Mark this, I'm going to leave the world with nothing. So I'm just
Mark's going to leave with a whole load of
He's sold already. No. So I'm just here to essentially live up this purpose. It goes back to this pyramid, self-actualization. Why am I here? And I think that is the driving force of every human being. And it is just a pain where you're trying to live out your purpose, but you have limitations on you financially. That's what I really think the issue is.
Yeah.
Finance gives you freedom, surely, doesn't it?
100%. It gives you the freedom to. We can't be naive if we look at inflation and we look at the cost of living. People are not likely to take risks on their purpose and what they're actually passionate about when they have 2 4-year-old daughters. They're just not going to make the decision. They're not going to make that risk. So it's just the same loop of them being caught into circumstance and justifying it after, and rightfully, situation. I have people to feed. I have my family to feed. So you have less people taking the risks to do that. So of course they're going to be unhappy. You see it on the tubes. You see people driving to work, sitting in traffic. I can't imagine that's very pleasant. It's miserable. That's why I wanted to escape it myself. And I think that we need to address the root of it, which is, I think, stems into the schooling system. You're not taught financial literacy in the early stages. You're not taught how to negotiate. You're not taught how to budget. You're not taught all of the communication. You're not taught any communication. You're taught, what do you think you're good at, and let's focus on that. So that doesn't help with the problem either.
You're taught about Pythagoras' fifth theorem as well, aren't you? Which is very useful in life, isn't it?
Yeah, extremely.
I mean, our government wants to make maths compulsory at A-levels to further that one, but not much. I've heard about the financial literacy piece in the education system.
Just even saving, just put 10% away. Even simple things. These are not complex. I'm not expecting someone to really go into, right, I want to be an investment banker or anything like that, but just how do you allocate certain percentages, teaching them ratios, save 10%, invest 10%. Like really simple, good self-discipline to not be month to month. Because I would argue a lot of people, they put themselves in this situation. You've seen people, you give them more money, they just spend more money because they don't have the financial literacy to actually do something with it, and then they're uncomfortable with it.
It's interesting you say that because, I once had a conversation with some very young German students who were all talking about pensions and savings. I mean, that might have just been the cohort of students that I talked to. But they said to me that this was just part of their teaching, part of their education, which I think is really interesting, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's important. I mean, the equation a lot of people also solve for is how much income do I need to make to build up my pension so I can retire early and get that income to pay me for the rest of their life. So a lot of people do make that calculation in their head and they figure out, I mean, certainly it might vary in different industries, but I think in the finance industry, they figure out how much do they actually need to earn to retire. And they come up with that age and they're set on doing that until they reach it.
Well,
The question you asked is a very valid question. It's nothing to do with economic growth. The reason why the future generation are going to be poorer than the current generation is because we've printed quadrillions of pounds and we've poured it into the hands of people with assets. That means asset prices have escalated, whether it's financial assets, which is your pension scheme, or whether it's the home, which is now, unfortunately, no longer a loving place where you bring up your family, but a financial asset which is increasing in value because of printing more and more money. So what we need to understand is that the system, again, we call capitalism, which literally means banks are allowed to literally print money. What that means is banks don't need bank deposits, don't need reserves of the central bank. They can literally print money and give it away. And that's why we've got a situation where the young people, it's going to explode, has to explode. They can't buy houses. They can't get pensions. That is not sustainable. Victor, it's crazy. I mean, it's not fair to you guys. It's simply, the system's been raped and pillaged by our generation. And there's nothing left for you guys. Of course we're going to have an explosion because you're not going to continue in the end to accept, I'm not going to be able to buy a house. I'm lucky if I can get rent for umpteen years. I mean, I don't know what your position is. Presumably, do you own your house?
No, so I still live at home. And I think you made a very valid point in terms of my sort of generation. So I'm Generation Z, what you want to call it. In terms of us thinking about getting onto the property ladder, unless you're, graduate working, in investment banking, in law, have a salary, that's high and work for a couple of years, it's sort of rent. However, I think then this goes back to, again, resourcefulness and sort of how do you exploit opportunities? That's what entrepreneurs do. So a lot of people from my generation, of course, because we grow up on social media, we're looking at alternative ways to make income or potentially get ourselves on the property ladder. You can sit down and complain about, what older generations have done, or you can go out there and do something about it. And I think that's what's happening now. But unfortunately, it boils back to education. Those who don't know will have a very tough time. Those who are constantly educating themselves, and I don't mean from the formal education system, like they're going out there to educate themselves by any means necessary, online, talking to people, networking, increasing their social capital, which I've had to do for the last couple of years because I came to that realization many years ago that, wow, if I don't put myself out there, if I don't try to get into, institutions like Cambridge or banking, it's not going to work out very well for myself. So.
And that's sad. What you're saying is sad, i.e. in order to be able to have a home, you need to do a meaningless job in the merchant bank. That's what you're saying, which is sad.
No, I'm not. You don't have to do means to emotional bank, but I think you have to do more than the average individual. You have to be very proactive and resourceful. That's what I'm saying.
Which means most people are not going to be able to, and that cannot be sustainable. It can't be sustainable. There's going to be an implosion.
You're obviously very self-motivated. You're
And
very-
bright.
And bright.
You're very-
And some people
very
aren't
bright.
academic.
You're very driven. You know, you've maybe been given a great upbringing. No idea your background, but given the toolkit to kind of go and attack life. But there's so many people that just don't have those attributes. So the system is really failing.
The homeless people, why can't they have a home with security? And all that you're dealing with is a failure of the system. No one's dealing with it. Until you change the system and we change the way we look at money, we change the way we look at rights and obligations, which I come back to, it's going to continue because the system has no means of ensuring that everybody gets their needs.
And there will be people like yourself that have that social mobility and do kind of make it and take off, but that, by the nature of it, will only happen to more exceptional individuals. And the vast majority of people, I think, the system, and I think it's a good question because intergenerationally it's getting worse and worse and worse, and the system's leaving more and more and more people behind. So I think whilst it will always be possible for certain individuals to kind of hustle and work and make it, I think it is important to pan out a bit and look at the wider system as well.
Yeah, and we are going to move on to the next discussion, but I just want to make the point that with my parents who were migrants and came over to this country, the environment that I was lucky enough or not lucky enough, I realise a little bit now, to grow up in was put your head down, which is like you, Victor, and work. I was blessed with a brain that was academic. There are many, many, many people, and that wasn't enough, by the way, to get to where I wanted to get to, because we don't live in a meritocracy. It's actually, it's a false reality, I believe.
Meritocracy is actually dangerous.